Okay, let's do this. So, what I want to talk about today is a topic that's very important, and it's one that I've talked around in previous videos or in things that I've written on my Substack or other things that I've said in interviews or whatever. I've certainly mentioned this before, and I mean, in reality, it's been something that I've talked about for years and years and years with friends, family, etc. But I haven't done a video dedicated directly to it, and that is the topic of false flags. So, of course, this comes up a lot in other things that I've mentioned when I've talked about, certain events that people generally nowadays, if they're aware at all, they consider to be false flags like 9/11. And I have said before that 9/11 is the event that kind of started to wake me up as to the way that the world works. What I did since then was as I kind of started to wrap my mind around what happened with 9/11. This was around 2007. Then I kept doing research and realized that, well, 9/11 is not necessarily a one off. In fact, this stuff kind of happens often, whether it's a false flag or other types of major deception operations, but a false flag is one of those. Okay. Now, what I want to do today is I kind of want to talk about the idea of a false flag, define what it is, and then go through a couple of examples of false flags. In fact, quite a few. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of supply a list of some of these. What I'm not going to do is talk about any of these in great detail. Any of these that you want to learn about, you can find other sources where you can go and look specifically into that particular event or incident. That's not what we're going to do today. Today is just kind of an overview of what false flags are, how they could be used, and then kind of do a quick sweeping glance through history using signposts along the way that consist of deception operations or false flags. Now, why is this timely? Um, so here's what this video is not. So I am not making a prediction that we are about to see some sort of false flag related to events that are going on in the Mideast right now. That said, I do believe that the situation is ripe for something like that to occur. I'm not necessarily predicting that it will occur. I'm certainly not predicting that if it did occur, what it would look like. But I am absolutely saying we are in a situation in which something like that could occur. I hope that it doesn't. We all hope that it doesn't. We pray that it doesn't. And in fact, we should be hoping and praying that this situation over there becomes resolved quite quickly, and with a cessation to the hostilities. I don't know if that's going to occur. Um, but regardless of that situation that is currently going on in the Middle East, and regardless of the fact that the situation is ripe for a false flag to occur, which is why we should be on high alert right now. But aside from all of that, even if that weren't going on, even if we weren't necessarily in a situation right now where we should be keeping our eyes peeled for the conditions that could um, be appropriate breeding ground for a false flag, even if none of that were true, none of that were going on right now, it would still be a topic that we should visit because it's one of these ideas that we need to visit from time to time because it does explain a lot of the way in which the globalist agenda moves forward. But I have a quick caveat to that. So I do think that there are different types of deception operations, with one of those deception operations being a false flag. So there are these massive deception operations or a massive false flag, which are globalist in nature. They are done with the specific intent to move the globalist agenda forward. But there are probably also many, many other false flags that aren't quite that significant on the world scale. They aren't necessarily planned by the, quote unquote globalists, but they may be planned by certain individuals that are part of one nation's government or a faction within one nation's government, and they may be done for some sort of more localized objective as opposed to something that is meant to kind of push the entire globalist agenda forward. Okay. So, yeah, like I said, you know, some event could happen in some country that could be meant to create some sort of objective that is localized to either one party in that country or that country and its government, and not necessarily the world. All right. So here's what we're going to look into today. So we're going to look into this book. Okay. So this book is by, hold it there so there's no glare, by John Hamilton. All right. I'm not super familiar with the author, if I'm being honest. Um, but I do like the book. Now, I don't agree with everything in this book, but I do like the book. So the book is called False Flags, State Secrets, Government Deceptions. All right. So again, false flags, state secrets, government deceptions. The subtitle is A Short History of the Modern Era. Now, this book is exactly what you would expect it to be with that title. And it's kind of what I just mentioned. If you were to take a sweeping view of the arc of history, but look at the discrete points along the way where certain government deception operations occurred. And a significant type of government deception operations is the false flag. So that's what this book is. So I just said a minute ago, I don't necessarily know a lot about the author. So if you look in the back of the book, you know, who is John Hamilton? It says John Hamilton's career spans government, business, and academia. He is a dedicated researcher and reader of history with keen interest in how it sheds light on current events and predicts future events. How did I come across this book? So I came across it fairly recently. This book's not very old. There are a couple of different editions of the book, and I have the most recent, which came out in 2022. I think originally it was published, I think in 2017 or 18. And then there were some updated editions. Like I said, this one's 2022. So it hasn't been around long. 2018 was when it was originally published. So not that old of a book. This is a recent edition. So there's some pretty recent stuff in it. So I came across it obviously within the last, 2 or 3 years or so. But I do like it. I do like it. So what I want to do is let's use this as a guide and see what our new friend John Hamilton tells us about false flags. And then let's go through a couple examples. Now we're not going to go through those in detail. We're just going to kind of touch on them just to kind of paint the picture of how often these types of operations occur. Okay, so let's look here in the beginning of the book at the definition of false flag. So I'm reading here in the beginning of the book on page 6. So what does the author say? A false flag denotes an operation conducted by individuals or a government body, official or unofficial, that will be blamed on opposition forces or someone else for political or other gain. All right. I'm going to read that again. A false flag denotes an operation conducted by individuals or a government body, official or unofficial, that will be blamed on opposition forces or someone else for political or other gain. So someone is going to conduct an operation. That operation will be blamed on someone else. Okay. It could be your enemy or it could be a third party. It originally referred to the false flags flown by pirate ships, the same flags of the ships that they were preparing to attack and board. This would prevent their intended victim from fleeing, providing resistance, or fighting, at least until it was too late. All right. So you can imagine it's a maritime concept originally. So the idea basically means, quite literally, you would put a flag up that is not your true flag. Therefore, it is a false representation of who you are, or the country you're from, or whoever it is that you represent. So that's where the term comes from, false flag. So you take down your flag, you run up a false flag to create the illusion that you are someone that you are not. And then that would allow you to gain much greater proximity to someone that you either wanted to plunder or attack or whatever. The author goes on. False flags are as ancient as man, conflict, and warfare. And then he gives an example. Listen to this. 2/3 of Rome burned down in a huge fire on July 19th, 64 AD. The Roman people blamed Emperor Nero. Some top Roman leaders, including the Roman consul Cassius Dio, as well as historians like Suetonius, agreed that Nero started the fire. This was based on the fact that the Roman Senate had just rejected Nero's application to clear 300 acres in Rome so that he could build a palatial complex. As it turned out, the fire did the clearing work for him. For his part, Nero, in the face of public opinion accusing him of arson, falsely blamed the Christians for starting the fire. He then rounded up and brutally tortured and murdered scores of Christians for something they didn't do. Okay, so what John Hamilton is doing is he's saying, hey, you could look at some examples of false flags, in ancient times. Now, like I said, I like this book. That does not mean that I agree with everything that is in the book. So his treatment of this topic is broader than just false flags. That's why the title is False Flags, State Secrets, Government Deceptions. So he will detail other types of deception that are different than a false flag. So false flag is a specific type of deception. All right, so he's got a couple of quotations here. But before we get to those, I do want to mention kind of a special thanks here. So he does say, we send our special thanks to the whistleblowers and authors who spend time and take risks to disseminate the truth. And then he credits a couple of people that compiled a lot of the material that was used in this book. So he relies heavily on kind of work that had been done by others, and then he compiles it into this list that he puts forth. And he mentions in here a couple of online sources, to include washingtonsblog.com. Now, what I assume he means when he says that is an article that was published at washingtonsblog.com that is, and we're going to look at it in just a moment, but it's called 42 Admitted False Flags. And I will put the link to that article in the description of the video because it's kind of a good companion to reference along with this book. So we're going to use the book today and we're going to go through a list. But if you don't have the book, and I do recommend this book if you're interested in this kind of stuff, or this would be a really good reference, this book here would be a really good reference for someone who is not quite up to speed on the idea of the false flag, or they don't realize that maybe they have been as prevalent as they have been. This might be a good place to start for them. But the same can be said of this article that I'm going to include as well. So we're not really going to go through the article, but it's from washingtonsblog.com. I will give you the URL. My assumption is that when he mentions Washington's blog in the book, where he mentions special thanks, I'm assuming that he's talking about this article or a previous iteration of this article, because this article says that it's from 2024 and this book is previous to that. But I feel like earlier versions of this article have been out, because I've heard about this article and this supposed list of 42 admitted false flags for quite some time. But regardless, this one that I'm going to provide the URL to, which is from April of last year, so April of 2024, is a pretty good list. His list is longer, but the list from the article is 42 false flags. He has a list that is a little bit longer than that, but it goes through some other things too that are not just false flags. But what I did want to read in this article is I wanted to just kind of give maybe like another definition of false flag, even though it's very similar to the one that he mentions. So the article starts out by saying, there are many documented false flag attacks where a government carries out a terror attack and then falsely blames its enemy for political purposes. They have another definition here, kind of in a graphic that they have right here at the opening of the article, that says, false flag is a horrific staged event blamed on a political enemy and used as a pretext to start a war or enact draconian laws in the name of national security. So I like the fact that the opening paragraph here mentions the word terror. A false flag attack can include a government act of terror. So an act of terrorism perpetrated by a government against its own people, which is just, I mean, you can't get more insidious than that. So a couple of quotations that John Hamilton in the opening of the book that he shares, and I'm just going to read a couple of them to kind of help set the stage for this. Terrorism is the best political weapon, for nothing drives people harder than a fear of sudden death. Who said that? Adolf Hitler. Why, of course, the people don't want war, But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along. Whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to do the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is to tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Who said that? Hermann Goering, Nazi leader. Anyway, yeah, so I just wanted to read those. He's got some others here. Oh, here's one from here's another quotation. The easiest way to gain control of a population is to carry out acts of terror. The public will clamor for such laws if their personal security is threatened. Who said that? Joseph Stalin. Now, at the end of the book, he says, and this is written, I don't know when this portion was written. I don't know if it was written in 2022, et cetera. It may be, but he says, some heinous crimes that have been labeled false flags or about which conspiracy theories have been advanced include the Las Vegas massacre, Boston Marathon bombing, the San Bernardino shooting, the Oklahoma City bombing, and many more. What is the truth about these and others? Who is really behind these atrocities? We just don't know. The term false flag has by now become almost trite in that it is applied to every major public or private event that belies sure and concrete explanation. Separating fact from fiction in real time is almost impossible. The facts of some false flags eventually do become public knowledge, but only after much time passes, often measured in decades. Now, I would agree with that. Not everything is a false flag, just like, you hear people drone on all the time about, not everything is a conspiracy, man. And that's true. Not everything is a conspiracy. Not everything is a false flag, but many things are. Okay. And if we don't even consider the possibility of massive government deception, then how is it that we're going to be able to make sense of the world that we live in? We can't. Okay. And that's the situation that many people find themselves in today, where they have a worldview that is just, it's inaccurate because it's incomplete, because they don't actually understand some of these competing dynamics that are constantly at play, because they still hold to this kind of incomplete notion of what I call history 101 or geopolitics 101, right? And we've talked about that before. Okay. So let's go through. We're actually going to do a little quiz. Now, this is John Hamilton's quiz from his book, but he has a list here of 60 false flags or other government deceptions. They're not all false flags per se, but many are. And he will give you a clue, and then he'll give you the answer in the back. So I'm going to read some of these, not all 60. And then I'll read the clue, and then I'll give you the answer. Okay. Some of these are pretty well known. If you've studied this at all, many of you will know them, and some of them may be new to you, and some of them are actually quite obscure. Some of the ones that are obscure, I'm not going to cover today. But if you're interested, you could always, look at the book, right? I think these are done chronologically through history, right? Okay. All right. So I'll give you a clue, and I'm not going to give you too long before I say the answer, because I don't want to be here all day. So you gotta know the answer quick. All right. The perceived threat of hostility from this neighbor country caused the U.S. to go to war. America emerges as the new owner of Texas, New Mexico, and California. Which war? Okay, that was in 1845. That was the Mexican War. All right. Number two, some of you probably knew that because as soon as I said, oh, the new owner of Texas, New Mexico, California, you probably were like, oh, that was the Mexican War, or, that was that war that preceded the Civil War. All right, got it. Number two, the resupplying of this fort by federal troops in the seceded state of South Carolina provoked the American Civil War. That's obviously Fort Sumter. That was in 1860. Many of you are aware of that. Some of you will be like, oh, that's not a false flag. That's not a deceptive operation. I don't know. We could quibble about that. I don't necessarily disagree with him. But anyway, the explosion of this ship in Havana Harbor provoked the U.S. to blame Cuba and start this war. All right, so that was in 1898. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, the Spanish-American War. Okay, so obviously the ship was the Maine. Loaded with arms for the British war effort against Germany, unbeknownst to passengers, this luxury ship sailed from New York en route to Liverpool. It was attacked by German U-boats and sank. Some 1,198 crew and passengers perished, including some 128 Americans. That was in 1915. That was the Lusitania. Many of you probably knew that. And many of you are probably aware of the problems with the official story of what happened to the Lusitania. If you're not, if you're like, wait, what? What do you mean? Like, what? That was a false flag or whatever. Well, go look it up. But yeah, there are a lot of problems with the official version of what happened to the Lusitania. The same with the Maine. So I remember when I was in college, I remember in a class having to give just like a small report on the Maine. Anyway, all right. The Japanese blow up their own train track in China and use it as justification to invade China in 1931. So this is known as the Manchurian Incident, also known as the Mukden Incident. Some of you may be familiar with that, others may not. That's not super obscure, but probably not very well known by a lot of Americans. This one is well known. When their parliament was set on fire, though uncertain of its origin, the Nazis blamed the communists and used the chaos to seize power. The name of the incident has come to be synonymous with false flag. What is that one? That occurred in 1933. That is the Reichstag fire. The Reichstag fire. The Reichstag fire. All right. Disguised as Poles, the Germans attacked their own radio station and use it as full cause to invade Poland the very next day. That's the Gleiwitz incident. Many of you are probably familiar with that. That's kind of considered to be the event that kicks off World War II. So that happened in 1939. Even if you weren't maybe aware of that name, you're probably aware of that incident. Okay. The Russians shell their own town to start World War II with Finland. That also happened in 1939. That was the shelling of Manila. The Russians captured and massacred nearly 22,000 Poles in 1940 and blamed it on the Germans. Where did this occur? Okay, this was the Katyn massacre, Katyn. Many of you, even if you didn't necessarily know that when I gave you the clue, you've probably heard of that somewhere along the way, or you've come across it, you've read about it somewhere. A date which shall live in infamy. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Now, some of you again are going to be like, what? What are you talking about? I don't know. He's not necessarily saying that's a false flag, but he is saying it's a deception operation. I think what he's insinuating here is FDR knew that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. Many people have said that. I tend to agree with that. So yeah, if you disagree, that's cool too. Like I said, I don't necessarily agree with every single one of his characterizations throughout this book, and I haven't read the whole book cover to cover. But I generally agree with him, and I do think it is a pretty good catalog of these types of events. This Cold War operation started as a plan to thwart post-World War II Soviet invaders, then morphed into a plot against homegrown communists and now Islamic terrorists. Now that part of the clue may not be super helpful, but this next part will be. The name derives from the Italian word for sword. Now, of course, that would be Operation Gladio, these would be the stay behind units after World War II, etc. When this Mideast nation sought to nationalize the oil fields in the 1950s, the CIA helped overthrow the democratically elected government. That's, of course, Iran, and the CIA installs the Shah. This is 1953. Some of you are familiar with Operation Ajax. Again, not a false flag per se, but could be like considered a deception operation. Certainly, in the West, people did not know what their publics were or what their governments were doing. In 1955, Turkey bombed its own embassy in Greece for what purpose? To incite anti-Greek violence in Turkey. Those types of attacks have been used a lot. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI undertook counterintelligence programs against its own citizens. What was the program called inside the agency? If you don't know this, you may recognize the name when I tell you. COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO. In the aftermath of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, this American UN ambassador denied the US had bombed Cuba. He thought he was telling the truth. Can you imagine? I'm going to read that again. In the aftermath of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, this American UN ambassador denied that the US had bombed Cuba. He thought he was telling the truth. So that was Adlai Stevenson. But I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine going and lying on behalf of your government? You don't know that you're lying. I mean, so you're being deceived too. Just anyway. At a June 1961 meeting, Bobby Kennedy suggested that the U.S. consulate in this Latin American nation might have to be blown up to provide a pretext for a U.S. invasion. The Dominican Republic. I actually did not know about that one. I thought that was really interesting, and I've been to the Dominican Republic. Yeah, but I did not know that. So if you did, but yeah, maybe you're on top of it then. At a June 1961 meeting, Bobby Kennedy suggested that the U.S. consulate in this Latin American nation might have to be blown up to provide a pretext for a U.S. invasion. Again, Dominican Republic. All right, in 1962, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff had a plan to attack American civilians and blame it on the Cubans to start a war. What is the name of this operation? Now, many of you, even if that clue doesn't necessarily make you arrive at the answer, you'll recognize the name, and that, of course, is Operation Northwoods. So some of you will recognize that. In 1964, American destroyer fires warning shot here versus local torpedo boats, and then alleges a false second engagement 2 days later used to start the Vietnam War. I'll read that one again because this is an important one. In 1964, American destroyer fires warning shot here. So where's the location? Versus local torpedo boats, and then alleges a false second engagement 2 days later used to start the Vietnam War. This is, of course, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So there's an attack that occurs, and then what happens is there's this report 2 days later that a follow-on attack occurred. And nowadays, many people say that follow-on attack 2 days later never occurred, but this Gulf of Tonkin incident was used to basically get us fully engaged in terms of combat troops in the Vietnam War. All right, this is an important one. Israel attacked this U.S. naval vessel off her coast in 1967. A cover-up by U.S. intelligence has been maintained to this day. This is obviously the USS Liberty. You hear about this one all the time. In 1972, Arthur Bremer shot and paralyzed presidential candidate George Wallace. Within hours, this president told his staff to pin it on a Democrat supporter. So that was Nixon. This 1972 crisis brought down a president and provided a shorthand suffix for all government scandals since this day. Yeah, that's obviously Watergate. Okay. From 1976 to 1983, the struggle between Argentina's right and left was called by this name. If you're familiar at all with Latin America, even if this doesn't jump right out at you, once I say it, you'll probably understand the term. So it's the Dirty War. Yeah, and when we use that term, the Dirty War, that's not just many Latin American countries have had what we would call a dirty war, but the one that happened in Argentina was particularly significant. Yeah, so at some point we'll talk more about Latin America. We'll do some videos that are kind of particular to some of the things that have happened in Latin America because I myself have spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I like to talk about that stuff. So, and it's important that we are familiar with some of the types of operations that occurred there, U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, and then also Latin America just provides a lot of case studies for things that have happened or things that are going on that can just be applied generally to other places in the world, or just provide kind of historical contextual awareness for us to greater understand how things really work. Okay. In two separate incidents in 1980, American trained troops killed the Archbishop and four churchwomen in this Central American country whose name means savior. Now, if you know Spanish at all, even if you have no idea what these events were, you should know that this has to be El Salvador, which of course means the savior in Spanish. So this archbishop would have been Oscar Romero. And then I'm not sure about this incident with the four churchwomen, but the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador was a huge deal, continues to be a huge deal to this day, many, many, many years later. But I also do know that there were some Jesuit priests that were also killed in Latin America in 1980. That was also a really big deal. I'm pretty sure that also happened in 1980. But the murder of these Jesuit priests, though, is not mentioned. What is mentioned is the murder of these four churchwomen. I'm not familiar with that specific incident, but supposedly that also happened in 1980. And of course, it did happen in El Salvador. Name 5 Western Hemisphere nations where the U.S. actively fought against Marxism. So again, I don't know that that's necessarily a deception operation, but there were a lot of shady things that happened, even in fighting shady Marxists. I mean, sometimes it's not easy to determine who the good guys are. That doesn't mean that 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 doesn't mean that I support Marxism. Of course not. But it doesn't mean that the people fighting the dirty commies are always the good guys. Anyway, he mentions Cuba, Chile, El Salvador, Grenada, and Nicaragua. Many believe. No, hold on. False testimony about Iraqi soldiers murdering incubator babies from this individual used to start the first Gulf War in 1990. And that is the Nayirah testimony. So I believe Nayirah was the name that the young teenage girl, she's like 15 years old or something. It was the young girl who provided the testimony that Iraqi soldiers were taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators and leaving them on the floor. You've probably seen videos of this. So that testimony was used as part of the pretext for the Gulf War. This is the original Gulf War, and that testimony was given in 1990. But then it came out later that this young girl who was going by the name Nayirah, that was not her real name, and that she actually was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, and her story, her testimony was fabricated. Many of you are probably aware of that. In 1989, South Africa affects numerous false flag attacks and actions against this group, the African National Congress. Many people believe this 1999 false flag operation was used to usher Vladimir Putin into power. Operation Successor and the Russian apartment bombings, killing 293, wounding 1,000. Many of you probably remember those apartment bombings. Medical experiments by doctors from this nation gives unknowing subjects a variety of diseases, including syphilis, cancer, and hepatitis. That is the United States. Some 3,000 engineers dispute the official story of the destruction of the World Trade Center. Name the group. The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. I remember coming across a lot of their information when I first started looking into 9/11. 1 month after 9/11, the US was terrorized by the mailing of multiple letters containing anthrax. This US president told the FBI to find a connection with what nation? Iraq. You guys remember this? Anyway, all right. Yeah, this is like kind of happening. The invasion into Afghanistan is going on. And then just shortly thereafter, immediately, now you've got deceptive people in government trying to figure out a way to also get into Iraq, between late 2001 and early 2003. In 2003, he told the UN that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. This assertion was put forth as reason for the US war with Iraq, but was later proved false. Colin Powell. This US president landed on aircraft carrier flight deck on May 1st, 2003, and proclaimed mission accomplished for the Iraq war that would continue, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, that is George W. Bush. Masada fighters go undercover, disguised as Arabs, to commit provocative acts for this Mideast nation, Israel. Colombian military lured unfortunates with promises of work, then killed them and presented them as dead rebels to boost body counts. Name the scandal. We will talk about that because that's a big deal. I remember when this was going on because I've done a lot of work with Colombians and the Colombian military. I have a lot of respect for Colombians, but that's a country that has a pretty crazy history. If you know anything about it, a very, very violent history. It's a country that has been, heavily exploited. But anyway, I remember hearing a lot about this kind of, yeah. Anyway, it's called the false positives. So the falsos positivos. So why false positive? Because you are saying that someone is like a member of the FARC. You're saying someone is a member of the FARC who's not, or a member of one of the rebel groups who's not. So they would take individuals and they would get them to, so soldiers would go, they would find people and they would say, hey, we want to hire you as a day laborer or whatever, to do some work for us. But then what would happen is they would bring those guys in and then shoot them and then dress them up as, members of the FARC and say, hey, look at all these dudes, look at all these FARC dudes that we killed. And they would send those numbers up to their higher headquarters as enemy KIA, enemy killed in action, basically. All right. So it's called the falsos positivos, the false positives. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's good. So again, the book, False Flags, State Secrets, Government Deception, A Short History of the Modern Era. So by John Hamilton. So again, my point here is not to give some sort of comprehensive, detailed explanation of any one false flag. It is just to kind of say, hey, listen, this is a phenomenon that occurs. And if you don't believe that, you don't know your history, you don't understand geopolitics, you don't understand how the world really works, and therefore you can't have a strategy for being successful because you don't even understand the operation that or you don't understand the environment that you're in. Okay, so you can't have a strategy for coming out victorious in this environment if you don't understand the variables that are at play in the environment. And that's why I do these videos, not because I'm some super smart dude who has it all figured out. A lot of times, if I write something on Substack or if I come to you guys and give a video, I see it more as, hey, let's explore this together. Or I'm sharing thoughts with you that I'm still working through in my head. Not that I'm, the genius that has this all figured out. Often it's the opposite, So for me, and I've said this many times, but the way that I came to question the way that things happen in the world and realize that they're not the way that we're told often is because of 9/11, which itself was a false flag event. So it's important that we understand the way in which these are used and understand that we must question government narratives. Okay. False flags or government deception operations have nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats or, one party, but not the other. One party is the good guys and the other. No, no. It's much broader than that. And in fact, even that kind of, partisan tribalism is part of what propels the deceptive machinery forward, or the tyrannic the machinery of tyranny forward, to put it that way. So, yeah. So first and foremost, let's understand what a false flag is. Second, let's understand that false flags are a real phenomenon. They occur. They even occur in countries that we consider to be the good guys. It's not just Russia that does false flags. No. Western nations, to include the United States, have done false flags on numerous occasions. They've also planned other false flags that weren't carried out, but they were planned. Look into Operation Northwoods, the one that we mentioned earlier. So that's kind of my point for today. Again, I am not in any way predicting that some sort of false flag is about to occur. And I hope that whatever's going on in the Middle East becomes resolved very, very quickly. But I don't know that that's going to happen. I mean, there are some evil people in this world who pursue bloodshed. But also, while I'm not in any way predicting, and I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not saying that, I have some sort of predictive quality in what I look out and see. What I'm saying is we have to understand the conditions in which false flags occur, because then we can recognize patterns. And if we learn to recognize patterns, then we could see that, hey, there are some things right now that, based on a historical pattern, look as if the conditions are appropriate that false flag could take place. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to try and, go further into that than what I just said. So, hey, thanks for hanging out with me and going through this important topic. I appreciate it. And if you would, like and share.